Ladies and gentlemen, dear investors, I would like to welcome you to today's live stream event, Accelerating Growth with New Therapeutic Approaches in Cancer. The year 2021 was once again characterized by the corona pandemic. However, we wanted to emphasize that also significant progress has been made in the treatment of cancer. And since about a third of all portfolio holdings of Biotech are active in this field, we chose the topic of cancer for today's live stream event. Oncology is a very broad field, and it can essentially be divided in two parts. The solid tumors such as breast cancer and lung cancer on one side, and the liquid tumors such as leukemia and lymphoma on the other side. The second part can also be summarized under the term hematology, and that's the focus of today's event. Dr. Daniel Koller, Head Investment Management Team of Biotech, will give an update on the Biotech portfolio with a focus on those companies that are active in the field of hematology. During his presentation, you can already post your questions via the online chat function, and we're happy to answer them at the end of the presentation. Now I would like to welcome Dr. Daniel Koller and hand over the word to Daniel. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Silvia. Thanks a lot, and welcome and good afternoon from my side. It's a pleasure to present to you both Biotech as well as what you see here in the title, that we have an acceleration of, as said, new therapeutic modalities in oncology. So we, on purpose, actually chose a topic outside of obviously the pandemic, but you see later on why we think, as said, oncology is obviously a key part of our not only industry but as well as Biotech's portfolio. And with that, here with the disclaimer that I'm not going to read for you, that you see on this slide, before moving over to quickly set out the agenda for today's presentation. It's going to be a very quick rundown, actually, over the company, the team, and the performance. Then we have under the second part, investing in innovation and the different diseases and technologies that we have a focus on, before explaining quickly the investment strategy, as well as then how the portfolio actually looks like in detail, before going then to the main part of today's presentation, which, as said, are the new therapeutic approaches in cancer in that specific regard, in the heme-onc, so hematological oncology indications such. Before then closing out with actually an outlook and investment case, and then happy to take questions that you can raise throughout the presentation. Just very quickly, a couple of facts. Many of you might know Biotech, but we launched as an investment company back in 1993, having the focus set, as obviously the name indicates, that we invest into the biotech industry with a focus on human medicine. We have multiple listings, the main listing being in Switzerland. We have as well important index membership that is here disclosed. And on the right-hand side, a couple of facts. The top one being that we are quite liquid, so you can trade us quite easily on these different stock exchanges. And one, actually, I would say, exception or interesting fact is that Biotech pays out the dividend. We have a 5% yield, and we are now in the midst of December, because December accounts for how much is actually paid out, because we use the average December share price multiplied by 5%, and this is going to be the proposed dividend that we're going to have the shareholders vote at the AGM in March 2022. You see the four current board members. We have Dr. Hunziker as our chairman, with Clive Meanwell as our vice chairman, Thomas von Plant, and then Mats Thompson. We had, unfortunately, the news that a British citizen, Susan Galbraith, had to step out from our board due to the fact that she got promoted at AstraZeneca, actually to be responsible for, as I said, the oncology research and development, obviously the core franchise at AstraZeneca, and for possible avoidance, obviously, of conflict of interest, she asked to step out. And we are quite optimistic that we're going to have news. How do we add to the board of directors that you see here by the beginning of next year? Because the shareholders will once again vote at the AGM in March 2022. On the team side, nothing has changed actually over the last year, I have to say. On the left-hand side, you see our colleagues that work from the East Coast. We have an office in New York. We have 4 PMs out of the 7 that work from Küsnacht, Switzerland, where you see here our nice offices right at the Lake of Zurich. And then the 3 investor relation colleagues that you see there with Silvia Siegfried-Jans, Maria Grazia, Ethan Alderuccio, and Claude Mickelson, who covers UK investors out of the London office that he actually, in general, is present. To the performance quickly, you see that the biotech industry leads to very positive and I think very attractive total returns over the longer term. You see in gray our benchmark, the Nasdaq Biotech Index, which is a representation of the broad or big part of the public listed US biotech companies. You see in black our net asset value, the book value, and in red our share price. And I said, with some volatility, nevertheless, we have achieved quite attractive returns. You see at the last 12 months, a 5-year, 10-year, and since inception. Just to frame this a bit for you, we have and still give the guidance that we want to achieve 15% return on invested capital. So it's here, for example, I said the last 12 months rather underperforming on that degree, 5 years slightly behind, 10 years obviously very strong, and since inception just a notch behind actually our goal. But that's part why we're optimistic for, I said, the biotech industry to go for a comeback and obviously have we think a highly attractively valued portfolio that will disclose a bit later on. The part in terms of how do we invest or where do we invest and in what do we invest is closed here. Still our 4 key areas, 3 of them, I would say, classical therapeutic modalities like cancer, where this industry is still actually investing the most. The third part here is central nervous system disorder, which we package together all the neurological as well as the psychiatry indication. That's a field that's strongly upcoming. We see a lot of investments there, for example, as well on the private side. Cardiovascular and metabolic syndrome see an almost empty space. We had one great case with myocardia that got bought out by Bristol Myers not too long ago, and you see here Esperon with a commercial, or with actually 2 products on the commercial setting. And then the second part, the orphan drugs, not a therapeutic, obviously, area, but rather description in terms of a smaller patient population. We segregate this out because it's quite important, because it's mostly where all the genetic diseases or the mutation-driven diseases are focused on, as well as obviously where many of these new modalities, such as gene therapy, gene editing, the RNA-based medicine, have at least started to build up their know-how and did their first clinical trials and had obviously substantial successes in many that is here represented. That's still the simplistic view in terms of the different technologies or modalities. Let's start at the top part, the new chemical entities, small molecules that most from us know from the sense that we obviously take pills. Can be an aspirin, can take something else. In the middle, already I would say more differentiated, because you have to give these medications less often. They're often very precise. These are the biologics, or then the RNA-based therapies. And then at the bottom part, really the curative intent, the real curative intent, I want to say, because it should be a once in a lifetime treatment, such as, for example, the gene therapies or gene editing mostly. And to some degree, you will see as well examples, for example, in the cell-based therapeutic world, what is possible and why we're excited about it. Before going to the part of oncology, quickly, because we had a very successful investment with Moderna, and as well as into the lower part where you see the other 3 companies in the RNA-based medicine field with Ionis, Alnylam, and Wave. Let me just quickly remind you about what RNA therapeutics or RNA-based medicine actually mean. And we all have in our DNA the storage function of genetic information. That has to be translated into function. The function is what you see there as this red string of pearls, actually the polypeptides or the proteins that drive function in cells. And you have a set, you have to translate this stored information that's said hidden up into these proteins. And that function is driven by messenger RNA. Messenger RNA in the good old days, 10 years ago, was mostly looked at how can we block it, so avoid the production of toxic or bad proteins. And Moderna flipped this on its head and said, we develop messenger RNA as the therapeutic modality. Actually, I call it simplistic as a gain of function, meaning you inject an mRNA into a patient or even in a healthy person. You generate protein production by the mRNA on a specific level and specific quantity. and then obviously drive the reaction that you want. In the case, obviously, of the spike vax, the very successfully launched SARS-CoV-2 vaccine that you see there described top right hand with this vial. Obviously, the mRNA coded for the spike protein. You inject this into muscle cells. These muscle cells take it up, produce these spike proteins, and elicit a very strong immune response. And that has been the basis for a very successful development, actually, of the SARS-CoV-2 prophylactic vaccine. And this is all reflected that you see there at the bottom part in the share price. We invested when the company was private in 2018, participated further in the IPO, bought even more shares throughout 2019. And then as 2020 started, and obviously the share price went into a rather steep rally, we started to take profits. Actually took substantial profits in the last quarter, in the third quarter of 2021, when we sold down around $300 million in terms of profit on the balance sheet for BB Biotech. And you see there the added volatility that has been generated over the recent weeks. We hold on to Moderna, not just because obviously it's one of the key players to hopefully solve the pandemic, with a set of prophylactic vaccine that's highly efficacious and safe. But you see here a plethora actually of other prophylactic vaccines, which we think are very important for the mid and long term, because they represent a sustainable business model, such as, for example, flu, so the influenza vaccine, RSV, CMV, and many others. Interesting will as well be that, for example, the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine can be mixed, for example, with flu or RSV, and that's already ongoing. The lower part, very interesting, but higher risk, with the exception of what we see in the orange part, actually the systemic intracellular therapies. There you see rare to ultra-rare indication, where we think as well the mRNA is perfectly suited, for example, as a protein substitute, in a sense that the injection with mRNA will lead to sustainable production, actually, or midterm production, obviously, of protein that's missing or dysfunctional. There the company had some delays because obviously the focus has been on the blue part, the prophylactic vaccines as such. And with that, a quick wrap up through the investment strategy as well as how the portfolio looks like per Q3. This chart is not new to investors of BB Biotech. I would say we focus mostly on the middle column there. So we have a broad universe, a few hundred public listed biotech companies, a very high number of actually private companies, and we track the more advanced companies or the ones we think are, from a technological point of view, very interesting to follow. Out of the disease modality or disease area field, combined with obviously the limit or the filter of these therapeutic modalities, as well as the filter of the development stage of these companies, avoiding the very early and avoiding the mature companies, we bring this down ultimately to a rather concentrated portfolio of maximum 35 position. And that's actually the classical investment cycle that you see here in terms of bottom left, actually the venture companies, startups that create around an interesting idea, a concept in the lab that obviously has to be translated then into ultimately a defined product that goes through clinical trial, product registration, launch, profit, revenue and profit growth, and then ultimately end up in a mature, diversified company. In our industry, these are the big pharma players. And our focus, as declared here, is obviously in this red circle, companies that are at the edge of starting clinical trials or have already done so are on our radar screen as new investments. We invest in these companies, we finance them by secondaries, meaning we inject capital into these companies, follow these companies through if they're obviously successful, and in general have their a long-term investment cycle in average throughout the portfolio of around 5 to 6 years, with the goal, I said, of 50% return on invested capital that we want to achieve. And the structure of the portfolio is always a certain concentration of between 5 to 8 companies at the top, and then 20 plus companies that are smaller to mid-sized in portfolio, because they're often younger, newer investments, or to some degree riskier. And that said, all the ones you see, for example, here on this portfolio as disclosed by the third quarter, the top companies are all the ones that we have done a few years ago and that have grown into this position in terms of obviously performance by the share price performance and over proportional performance in the portfolio. You see, we have done 2 investments in 2021. That's less or a bit below the average we had in the past. That had two reasons. One is, I said, we looked at companies. B, the pandemic played a role. And last but not least, we saw a lot of opportunity actually in the existing portfolio to deploy capital. So we have, throughout 2021, for example, invested substantial amounts of capital into oncology, small and mid-cap companies, as well as selectively into the neuro space as such. On the other hand, besides obviously then the Revolution Medicine and ESSA, which are the two new holdings in 2021, both of them as well, oncology companies with the focus actually then on solid tumors. And here you see the depiction of the portfolio from a top-down view. On the left-hand side, the different disease areas, oncology, orphan disease, and neuro, making up around 3/4. Infectious disease is nothing else than Moderna, because that's pretty much the only exposure we have right now in that space. In the middle, you see there in the Kringle chart, 40% plus in the small molecule world or new chemical entities versus 60% into new technologies. On the right-hand side, around 45% of the portfolio currently in the smaller cap, which we define as below 5 billion. That's as well where most of the active capital goes into. Then around a third of the portfolio in this larger mid-cap space, and around a quarter of the portfolio plus minus in the large cap space, where currently, as I said, we have Moderna and Vertex as the key players actually in that part of I said, the portfolio as such. And to bring it back to today's main part of the presentation, actually the oncology, you see here it's not a coincidence we picked oncology. It's around a third of the portfolio, but you see a large number of positions on the right-hand side. Many of them actually have focused on solid tumor, and as I said in today's presentation, we will focus on the hematological cancer indication, and you will see later on that we have actually picked 4 companies, existing portfolio companies, that either partially or exclusively focus on hematological cancer indication as such. And these 4 are represented here. This is our long-term since inception chart. When did BB Biotech invest into different technologies? See, we started in 1993 with small molecules, antibodies and proteins, then added the peptides, the antibodies, the complex antibodies, all the way to RNA-based medicine, and at the very top, the gene editing technologies, in our case represented here by CRISPR Therapeutics with the CRISPR-Cas9 technology. Here as well, already newer investments such as Beam, and we look even on the private field or at the private equity side of things. They're already further advanced and newer technologies that play a role in the gene editing field as such. But the 4 we're going to talk today are on the right-hand side. So that CRISPR that deploys the gene editing technology into the CAR T, so into a cell-based therapy. You see Fate purely focused on actually cell-based therapy, but they deploy, we think, a very interesting technology as such, and start on the stem cell side. Macrogenics has complex antibodies / bispecific antibodies, and you will hear an example in AML. And then at the very bottom there, inside to the right, at the bottom part there, got actually access to an antibody developed by a German biotech company called MorphoSys, a CD19 antibody that, as I said, Incyte has partnered and is now commercializing together with MorphoSys as such. And with that, let me move over to the main part of today's presentation. Actually, I said new therapeutic approaches in cancer in the hematological field. But let me try to set the level here and start very basic actually. What do we understand and what's actually driving a tumor? We are all built up from normal cells, and these cells throughout our lifetime are exposed to continuous stress. They can replicate, think of, for example, the whole blood system. They can mutate as well, just because of external influence, such, for example, as ultraviolet light. And we have great, actually, modalities to control for these dysfunctional cells. 2 main ones mentioned here are that we have the so-called gene mutation or the gene repair mechanism that mostly work on replicating cells. And then the immune system, which is a great tool actually for our body to control what is healthy, what is unhealthy. And if that fails, you see at the bottom part there, very schematically depicted, it can take only one, or it takes only one single cell that accumulates certain mutation, can avoid the immune system, grow into in that case, solid tumor mass, and then ultimately as well lead to the problem of metastasis formation, meaning the tumor starts to spread in the body, and then treatment becomes very complex and often very difficult. The different treatment modalities here for both solid and the so-called liquid tumor, if I can call them like here, are depicted here. So that's in the case the patient has already developed cancer to a certain stage. In the solid tumor field, you have two modalities that we don't use in actually the liquid tumors. One of them is obviously surgical intervention. So you have a solid tumor mass that you can excise and cut out, and you do that precisely. That can help. Hormonal therapy as well, quite exclusively actually for obviously the solid tumors, mostly for breast cancer and prostate cancer, both big cancer indications that are driven where actually the hormones are a key part of the growth driver of the tumor. And then we have radiation therapy as well, to some degree. Chemotherapy, I said 10 years ago, I had hoped we talk less about this, but chemotherapy is and remains one of the mainstay actually of the treatment algorithm for both solid and liquid tumors. We can obviously combine them differently, and today's talk will focus more on the upper left-hand side, the immunotherapies and actually targeted therapies that we think play a big role both on the solid tumor side, but even more so already now with quite a few approved products in actually the hematologic cancer as such. And very quickly, what's hematology? Hematology is obviously part of the internal medicine that covers, I said, benign and malignant disease of the blood, and I said of the lymph node and the lymphatic system. And I'm going to mention here two examples from different angles. One is actually the AML, so a leukemia. We're going to present you, for example, macrogenics with a molecule that they develop, as said, for so-called second-line patient. And then lymphoma, which is a bigger indication, meaning more cases of actually patient present. There you will see a couple of results, mostly from the diffuse large B-cell lymphoma side, for both Incyte, CRISPR, and Fate that have developed their drugs or are on the way, obviously, to work their way through the clinical trials. And what is the diffuse large B-cell lymphoma? Let's start there. It's nothing else than actually the B cells, so part of our immune system that's there to produce antibodies that then tackle, for example, viral or bacterial infection. You can, for example, consider obviously now the SARS-CoV-2 as such a case, where with the vaccines you try to produce as an early response high antibody titers. These cells go havoc, they turn actually mutagenic, and ultimately they become from benign, they become bad actors and tumorigenic. And you see at the lower part a histological depiction of that. That tells you less. But actually what happens, because it's part of the lymph system, where these white blood cells circulate and actually sit as the control function, often the lymph nodes are actually where you see a lot of this tumor growth happening. And you see there in this top right corner on a person, actually on a cartoon of a person, said throughout the lymph system and the lymph nodes, that's where you see most of the growth of these tumor cells. We have since more than a decade, almost 2 decades long now, a good therapy that we call R-CHOP. That's an antibody together with chemotherapy and other small molecule reagents that actually leads, and here you see such a flow chart that leads. Let's start at the top in blue with a patient, a diffuse large B-cell lymphoma patient. If you do the standard therapy, the green part, around 2/3 of them are cured, and 1/3, unfortunately, is relapse refractory, meaning the tumor comes back quickly or at some point in time, and then actually starts the trouble in terms of what can you do now for this more advanced cancer patients with often rather aggressive tumors that generate problems. And then we go down the line for today and say, okay, in the second line therapy, you have two options. Some can go on high dose chemotherapy once again and try if that works. Ultimately, we have to go, for example, for a transplantation. Or on the right-hand side, the classical second-line therapy that a lot of the new companies and a lot of the upcoming companies work. Many of the clinical trials happen there, actually. That's where you try, obviously, to add something for these patients. And two we will disclose or present today that are already approved. On the left-hand side, you see the CAR-T, the cell-based therapy from our old investment in the long past being Juno and Kite. These products are today sold by Bristol Myers Squibb or, for example, Gilead, because they bought these companies. Monjuvi in the middle in combination with lenalidomide. That's nothing else than our good old Celgene with Revlimid, today Bristol Myers Squibb as well. These products are approved, and then clinical trials. And I'll show you two examples that are currently in the clinic or in clinical trial development on the CAR T side, because there's a lot of evolution ongoing, how to improve these over the so-called autologous or first generation products that we have out there. But let's start first on the antibody side. And you will hear me speak more about the CD19. And to make it simple, CD19 is a protein like a signal or like a marker that sits on the surface of, for example, these B cells and precursor B cells. And that's then an ideal way, for example, to say, okay, if these cells, the tumor cells, carry the CD19, I can develop an antibody that actually recognizes this marker on the surface. So it binds to the tumor cells. The other side of the antibody binds to an immune cell and actually lead then to a targeted cell killing from the immune cell towards obviously the malignant P cell that you see there at the bottom part, that you see there in the bottom part in the middle. And the product got approved, is selling, not selling great, but selling good or solid and growing. And here, for example, see clinical data on the left-hand bottom part, the overall survival curve, meaning if patients got treated with Monjuvi and lenalidomide, how long was actually their survival. This study was so, we can call it uncontrolled, because there was no control arm. So we don't know actually how much better it would be over others. And that's still what Insight and MorphoSys are now doing, for example, for the first line patient, meaning they want to move all the way up into the standard therapy, if you recall the slide, where the patient's journey started. But here you see the clinical data. If it was a classical second-line patient, we had around half of them survive after 4 years, which is a very good result compared to historical standards. And if it's multi-year of therapy, actually the survival rate goes right away down to around a third at the 4-year time point, obviously with small sample size. And on the right-hand side, you see here one of the downsides of antibody therapy. You have to repeatedly dose the patient, similarly to what you do with the chemo cycles. You see here in blue the induction phase, where you give a lot of the antibody to the patient in a short period of time, and in a so-called maintenance phase in the light blue part, where you less often, but nevertheless repeatedly dose the patient. And that same target, the CD19, has actually had a big impact or implication on the so-called cell-based therapy in the past. And this is here on that next slide, quite simplistically depicted. We talk here about the autologous CAR Ts or cell-based therapy, meaning these immune cells, these killer cells, were actually isolated from the individual cancer patient. So a patient with diffuse large B cell, much advanced, gone through all the other therapies, no more option, goes into a special center, gets blood drawn, actually cells isolated that are, as I said, these T cells. They're in the lab, then engineered genetically, they're regrown in the lab and reinfused into the cancer patient 3-4 weeks later. Very complex procedure, highly expensive, but if you see now, and apologies, these are small slides, but focus on actually the 3 different depiction or clinical data readouts you see at the right-hand side of this chart. The so-called duration response shows you give this therapy once, and these patients have been very advanced. Many of them had no more option, were already on the way or in the hospice because there was nothing else that could be done for them. So you see here actually the difference between so-called complete response, where the therapy has achieved a great result, meaning a clearance or total clearance of the tumor. You see in blue some with objective response, and you see as well how dire the outcome can be on the orange curve there for so-called non-responders that obviously then have a fast progression of the disease. And all of this ultimately translates into an overall survival. So this is the entire patient population at the bottom part on the right-hand side. You see after 18 to 24 months, around half of the patient is still alive. And from then on, we see a flat line, meaning these patients are cured probably for years to come, and the cancer will not come back. And the same approach, but now a step more, let's say, industrialized or hopefully optimized, at least in the manufacturing process, as well as in the quality of the cell, is what CRISPR Therapeutics is now applying with their CRISPR-Cas9 technology. So instead of working with every individual patient and produce an individual product for all these patients, which is very complex, expensive, and then with a certain time delay, which can create a lot of problem. You take cells from a healthy young individual, you isolate the same T cells, and you genetically modify them, a bit more complex as depicted on the right-hand side. And then you have a certain batch between 50 and 100 bags that you have ready in the fridge, obviously, of the hospital or the company that can be shipped and treated right away. So the goal here is not patient-specific cells, but from a healthy individual, many doses, and as I said, faster, accessible, and better characterized. And you see here results, very small numbers still, because this is an ongoing trial, a typical dose escalation trial. So if you see, for example, in the dark blue bar there, it started with 30 million cells, then 100 million cells, 300 million cells, 450 to 600 million cells. And you see there how the complete response or the response rates actually go up. And that's a good thing because it means that you have a good dose response. And you have similar results than actually the first generation. But I think a picture is actually more impressive. This is obviously, as a disclaimer, a so-called complete responder. So one of the patients that responded the best. You cannot respond better than that. And you see here the example of a 62-year-old woman who has gone through multiple different line of therapies, even a stem cell therapy, failed, had no more option, registered into CRISPR Therapeutics clinical trial. And you see here the outcome at the baseline, this highly visible stained white blob there is nothing else than a lymph node full of diffuse large B cancer cells. And you see after 12 months, she was completely free of the tumor with a single, as I said, administration of this therapy. And I think that's obviously great news for that individual patient and the goal for the industry to obviously achieve that in as high as possible numbers that you can have. The problem here is still, it's still not fully industrialized, but here you see still the results that look similar. So on the right-hand side, the autologous part, meaning the first generation product, a broad patient set. On the left-hand side, you see here the results for CRISPR Therapeutics, including all of the dose. So over time, at the high dose, we assume actually these charts will look very similar and comparable. Then we think the more convenient and actually easier product and potentially even cheaper product, because it's much less cost intense, will ultimately win as well in the market. Right now, these products sell between 1.3 and 1.5 billion. That's an estimate for 2021. And we think there's a lot of room if these products ultimately go into earlier line of patients. But we think as well, for that, you need the next generation once again. We can call it the third generation. And that is the basis for our investment in Fate Therapeutics. They don't use T cells, they use the other part of the immune system, actually so-called NK or natural killer cell. But the rest of the story sounds very similar. You isolate an NK cell, but in that case, a so-called stem cell. You genetically modify the cell, and you can grow at infinite, so infinite numbers of these cells in the lab. So it's a full industrial scale process that leads to an absolute well-characterized product, and that you have on the shelf ready to be used whenever a patient shows up. And actually, obviously, we don't know yet how good that works. So let me show you a couple of points. First, on the left-hand side, a cartoon of such an NK cell. That was the so-called first generation of Fate. And we had initial expectation that we would see little to nothing. And actually, the market got surprised that in combination with an antibody, we saw great responses in some patients. But our focus is much more what you see on the right-hand side, the so-called FT596, which has three major modifications. One is the so-called CD16 molecule that leads to efficacy and binding with different antibodies you could give as already approved therapeutics. Then you see the CAR19, which is nothing else than a molecule that actually binds CD19 once again on a malignant B cell. And then in green, you see there in the cartoon a couple of proteins on the surface that are to propel and obviously sustain the efficacy of this NK cell. And that seems like, you know, exciting news, at least for a biologist or a medical person, because that these cells are highly characterized and they look all the same. And that's the big difference if you think of the first generation autologous or even second generation allogenic cells, because every batch is different in manufacturing, quality, number of cells, etc. But here you have an exquisite defined cell population that Fate already has put into clinical trials, and you see here, for example, results from very small trials, just a couple of patients that are in each of these individual arms here. And let's focus on 596 on the right-hand side. You see they tried it as monotherapy, so as standalone only cell, or in combination with an antibody. They tried different chemotherapy conditioning because that's what has worked best in the past with cell-based. They've used an antibody, yes or no, and they've done one dose only in that case and no more cytokine stimulation. And obviously, I said, simplified the process quite a bit in terms of how these patients have to be treated. And the results, even smaller number, let me admit that here as a disclaimer, but let's focus mostly what you see at the bottom part. So we've seen 10 out of 14 patients respond with a so-called tumor response, meaning tumor shrinkage. Half of them have been so-called complete responder, the tumor's completely gone. And I said they're still escalating the cell dose or the dose of how much they give to each individual patient quite a bit. So we have been at 300 million cells. They will test now 900 million cells. And let's see if the response rate and obviously the complete response rates once again go up. And that's a similar depiction than before, but now not seen from the top actually, as a cross-section of a 60-year-old male, 6 prior lines of therapy, already treated, for example, with an autologous CAR T, so a first-generation cell-based therapy, failed, the tumor came back. So you see there, again, the bright white color coding is actually tumor mass that grows. One treatment, and here we unfortunately know only day 29. So after 1 month, tumor is completely gone. The question will be, and Wall Street is asking the same question, how will that look like at 6 months, 12 months, and even 2 years down the road? Because you want to see long-lasting complete response, because that's the ultimate way to a cure as such. And with that, let me move over to a small presentation about the AML space. So here we talk about leukemia. You can say it's a blood type cancer. It's not the lymphatic side of the cancer system. And it drives actually, or it's driven actually within the bone marrow as such. You see at the top right, actually if it's normal in its division, you know, these cells, the stem cells start to produce red blood cells, platelets, white blood cells, etc. And very far right, you see one of these cells actually goes from benign to tumorigenic, starts to overproduce or overamplify and obviously squeezes out the others. And that's exactly what happens as a clinical manifestation for AML patients, meaning they suffer from loss or lack of red blood cells, so they're anemic. They suffer from a lack of blood platelets, meaning they have a lot of bleeds. And they suffer as well because they have no more white blood cells, meaning a lot of infection all the way to sepsis. And here, a similar story, we had very intensive chemotherapy and actually led to good outcome. So the ones that can tolerate that, they have a 70% cure rate in terms of obviously going from a very strong chemo regimen all the way to a stem cell therapy, and then are ultimately cured and the cancer will not come back. And here you see the flowchart here from left to right. Untreated AML patients in blue, followed then by often what's done today, the genomic profiling, meaning the physician and the industry wants to understand what's driving the tumor and how to best treat that. In green, you see whoever is fit for intense chemotherapy most often goes for that. And the ones that are unfit or won't tolerate that, or even relapse, they try then often on the gray part, meaning a lot of new small molecules all the way to biologics that we have, and antibodies that are tested as so-called second and third line therapies, obviously to drive still the AML cancer patients towards stem cell therapy, which ultimately, as I said, is the cure. That's, I won't go in detail, but you see here in that table, in the last 4 or 5 years, multiple new product targeted therapies that were approved. I just want to mention the second lowest part in the top table, that's Tibsovo. That's a specific treatment tailor-made for so-called IDH1 mutation patients. It was developed by Argos, approved in May 2019, and roughly 1.5 plus minus 2 years later was sold with the IDH2 mutation molecule as a package deal to Servier for around $2 billion. And Argos has now moved out of the cancer space and moved over into actually the orphan disease setting as such. But one company we still have, and we are a bigger shareholder actually in Macrogenics, is Macrogenics, that develops complex antibodies, bispecific antibodies as well, all the way to the good old antibodies of the past. And here at the bottom left part, you see a cartoon of such a bifunctional antibody, or they call it DART molecule. The blue X or cross actually tackles or binds to the tumor cells. In the AML cell, it's not CD19, it's CD123. And the orange X that you see down there is actually the part that binds to a T cell. So what it does is just telling the T cell, okay, you bind to a tumor cell, I help you recognize it, I help to get in proximity, and now you have to kill, obviously, the tumor cell. And that's as well quite efficient, as you see in a bit. AML, as you see here on that slide, around 46,000 cases in the G7. So it's a more rare form of tumor, a very severe one though. And it's here, again, the difference between what you can do as treatment algorithm, and Macrogenics is focusing on these two orange boxes, meaning patients that have failed right away on this very intensive chemotherapy, or the ones that have relapsed later on. And you see a result. This is from the so-called proof of concept clinical trial, so a phase 1/2 that we can say. It's a so-called waterfall plot. The x-axis represents the baseline of the tumor mass. If you go down, that's great news because the tumor mass shrinks. If you go up, it's bad news because the tumor grows. And you see on the left-hand side, around a quarter of the patient had growth. That's not good news for these patients because they have hardly any alternative left. And all the ones on the right-hand side, you see a tumor shrinkage. And ideal for these patients, if they have such a small asterisk on top, the tumor mass was so efficiently killed that actually the patient could roll over and take a stem cell transplant. That's ultimately, as said, the curative intent for AML patient. So with that, I just want to close out on the part of the heme-onc side, and hopefully I could have translated some of our enthusiasm that we see a great progress actually all the way from the technology point of view, but as well individual assets that we have within our portfolio companies. And with that, would move over to actually an outlook and to close the presentation. You see here on the left-hand side, I said the industry, and in our portfolio we have a strong focus towards that, is actually the different progress of the technologies that ultimately translates into treatment options and modality, and treatment options that in the past would not have been possible. We all have, as a society, experienced how mRNA technology can translate very efficiently and even aggressively in the clinical trial development into very successful and highly efficacious vaccines. We have similar approaches in the gene therapy, but mostly in the gene editing side. We have as well the cell-based therapy that are right now much more geared actually towards the smaller indication that we see in the hematological oncology side of things, but obviously the ultimate goal would be to move them into the solid tumor field. In the middle part, I mean, the administration, that's more of US focus because a big part of the biotech industry is still influenced by the US. I said Joe Biden has now nominated the new FDA commissioner with Robert Califf. He has yet to go, obviously, through the hearings. But we think that will all work out. But as I said, the FDA has been, I would say, a great player towards innovative products in the past, and we expect actually from him, often seen even to be too friendly and close to the industry, the same on a forward basis. And in US healthcare politics, that's a constant back and forth that we have there. As I said, obviously a big infrastructure bill by the Democrats in the US Congress, with part of obviously the bill being how can you finance that and how can you at least offload some of the costs. And that could be all the way down to drug price reduction, but there I said we don't expect radical changes, but more gradual changes. And it will be interesting to see if in 2022 how the midterm election will shake out, and if obviously some of that then becomes a different discussion once again. But focusing more back on BV Biotech, what drives my enthusiasm and how to try to explain in actually I think in a couple of slides why we are a growth investor. And we achieve very high growth rates, actually multiple times of actually the industry growth rate in average, or even more so, for example, of big pharma. And we think ultimately this will play out, is actually that the industry and our portfolio companies develop drug. And you see here from 2018, 19, 20, it's a bit more a quiet year in 2021, but we still have a couple of important product approvals. And let me start with Caplyta, and that's from our portfolio company Intra-Cellular. is in discussion with FDA, and we have a PDUFA date in a couple of days for the approval for bipolar disorder. The same is for efgartigimod for a rare autoimmune disorder called general myasthenia gravis by argenx. They own this product entirely, will sell it globally as well. mRNA 1273, so Spikevax, still not fully approved. And last but not least, with a bit less visibility on timeline, is inclisiran from Alnylam together with its development commercial partner Novartis. It could happen in December, it could happen as well in January or February, we don't know. But I said here we have, I think, very important product and product line extension that will propel what I just described, actually an overproportional growth curve for BB Biotech. So our ownership in these companies, calculated by the revenue curves you see here, we're at the end of 2021 and we go on a steeper trajectory. On the right-hand side, you see the same chart actually dissected not by actually the total revenue, but dissected by a set of different therapeutic modalities. And here in even more detailed depiction in a sense, neuro, psych, oncology, cardiovascular, metabolic disorders and others are expectation that we have there for substantial revenue growth to come. And at the very bottom part in dark gray, you see as well our base case that we have, for example, for the Moderna Spikevax product, so a peak revenue expectation for 2022. And then we think ultimately the pandemic will slow down and obviously will end up in an endemic phase before then ultimately, as said, the next generation product will pick up. With that, I come to close to the end. I said from a portfolio side, I could hope to have convinced you that I said it's an attractive mix of disease areas, of therapeutic modalities, as well as investments. I think we have a very experienced and high-profile board of directors, as well as a team that works together for a long time. And the right-hand side is a bit more of a speciality that I said we combine this high growth and capital gains and total returns we have by being a blend of the capital gains and then a dividend policy on top. And last but not least, a newer topic, the ESG and sustainability discussion that we have in the biotech landscape. I think it was driven very strongly by continental Europe and continental European investor, but we see now a shift as well. You see very strong exclusion criteria. We are actually qualified as an Article 8 investment for our shareholders. At the bottom left, you see actually, I said, the carbon dioxide footprint, obviously not the big topic because I said the industry is not very intense on that. And on the right bottom part, right-hand side at the very bottom part, you see there that actually our portfolio, although we have a strong tilt and over allocation towards small and mid cap, we nevertheless have there, I would say, a good or high quality actually rating, even better than, for example, the benchmark. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention and hope now that, as said, we have one or the other question that came up that we can address now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for the exciting and very informative presentation. We have collected some questions from the audience, and I would like to start right away with the first one. How high is the risk of an overreaction of the immune system after CAR T-cell therapy of the second or third generation compared to a CAR T-cell therapy of the first generation?
Yeah, so in the first generation, actually, I remember well that we had some even tough days because at the very beginning, physicians were not used, not trained, or didn't know how to apply them best. So we had, for example, very severe so-called CRS syndrome, so even patients dying because of the therapy. And that has now all improved. So we have learned in the meantime to better dose them. And I said we have so-called rescue medication because CAR T cells, the first generation as well as the second, if you infuse them, they will expand within the patient and they can be like an overdrive for the so-called immune system as such. And that's actually an interesting part. So I think that the second generation CAR Ts, the so-called allogenic, what we have seen so far is that they have a very similar to sometimes even better profile, at least to the old data we have seen regarding severe side effects. The allogenic cells, you obviously want to check for if the patient's own immune system is not attacking them, because they ultimately are seen as foreign. And that's why, for example, you have to make more genetic modifications, such as, for example, cut off the MHC1. That's a bit more detailed. that ultimately leads then to the question of sustainability. And the same is for NK cells, but they work quite differently in a sense that they don't expand in the body. So that's why you dose them very thoroughly and very precisely. And there we have actually seen that the side effect profile looks very promising. It's obviously a small data set, but that could be another big differentiator, I think, in the context, at least for the NK cells, versus both the first and second generation CAR Ts that we have out there. But it's nevertheless, often it comes that this high efficacy comes not hand in hand, but at least drives a lot of side effects as well. And I think there we have seen a lot of improvement, and we see as well even first generation autologous company nowadays obviously develop these further, improve them further, try to use less dose and avoid not just side effect, but obviously try to peak as well, or increase obviously the response rate.
The clinical results of FATE look pretty impressive. Why did the market react rather negatively?
Yeah, that was as well kind of like where I would say I will not say we struggle, but sometimes we are surprised. So said we saw, I would say, quite strong results from FATE. I have to admit it's early days, and you saw it's not even at the high dose yet. But I think the major disappointment, at least that we saw when we discussed them both with the company, other investors and brokers, was ultimately that the expectation was there towards duration of response. Although I said these patients were just treated not too long ago, and you could by that not even expect duration of response, the main focus for the market is right now, will these so-called complete responses well hold up, and will ultimately the rate look similar, potentially even better than what we have seen with the so-called autologous product, because that's what the market is up to compare and contrast. And in oncology, it's often that obviously efficacy is the key driver of adoption and usage. And from that perspective, I think at ASH, that's going to start now soon. Unfortunately, conference we in the past attended physically now is all virtual, at least for us. We're going to see data now the next 6, 12, 18 months to come that will answer the question of durability. But I said fate will not stand still, and we used the sell-off that we saw in the valuation share price actually to add quite substantially to the position throughout Q3.
Will industrial therapies rather than personalized therapies ultimately render chemotherapy unnecessary, or will it always be too expensive to use as a first-line option?
I think that's a great question. So I said, obviously, chemotherapy you can only avoid if you ultimately are better or at least equal efficacious. So that has to be first proven. But what I said is that these technologies now have to develop as well towards the cost base. Meaning I recall when the first generation autologous product were launched, we talked about cost of goods somewhere between 150,000, sometimes even $200,000, where I heard it even from university in Europe that said, their production cost with no margin and no infrastructure cost was between 120 and 140,000 euros. So that's not sustainable if you want to move obviously into frontline settings. But I have to say, on the other hand, if you contrast that with the efficacy or the strong result, I think actually, although the price is very high, that's actually, I think, a very fair reflection, obviously, of the effect size you get. But we think, ultimately, if you want to, or if you can industrialize it, you will win on multiple fronts. A better characterized product profile, a clean product profile, which means it's always the same for every individual patient that gets it. Much lower cost of goods. So we think that's a big part as well, what you will need if you want to move efficaciously into so-called frontline settings and into much broader patient population. And that's a big part of our investment case in actually FATE.
There are various companies looking into mRNA technology, including BioNTech. How do you differentiate between the leading players?
I said we looked at that field back in 2016-17, but then actually I said invested in early 2018 for the first time. And in the past it was we had mostly 4 companies out there that we looked at in detail. Now we see many more new ones coming up that even tweak how they work with messenger RNA once again. But what has triggered us to invest into Moderna and not into the others was a combination of modified mRNA, so the uridine has been modified, actually BioNTech does the same, Other companies did not do so, and that was for us kind of like already, I would say at least a yellow flag, so to speak. Then we looked at the patent landscape, and we looked at the packaging. So how do you wrap these mRNAs efficiently into these LNPs, and how good these LNPs work, and where you can use them, and how often you can use them, and how safe they are to be used. That was another important, I would say, distinction between the different companies, all the way to the balance sheet. And last but not least, very importantly, back then in 2018, Moderna was by far the most advanced and the most pushy towards prophylactic vaccines. And other parts of the business followed or were at a similar pace back then, but they went quite broad early on, whereas other companies in the past have focused, for example, on therapeutic cancer vaccines or other approaches that we saw as interesting but as a higher risk, and at that point in time not to be invested. And obviously we ran into the pandemic. Share price have moved quite aggressively. You heard we took profits in Moderna, and we probably would have done the same on the biotech as such. And from that perspective, there was no more chance for us to add. And we, in general, avoid so-called basket investments because we run a concentrated portfolio approach. So if you would have 80 or 100 investment, you would probably have added 2 or 3 mRNA players. We have selected this. I told you on the CAR-Ts in the past, we've done 2 investments, Juno and Kite. And back then, we had a hard time distincting which one would work better, or because they looked very similar, at least on the surface and on the way we could analyze them. Juno stumbled in terms of safety events, and that was the chance for Kite to overtake. Ultimately, both were taken out and quite successful. But mRNA, we watch obviously what the others are doing. But I said it was a multifactorial kind of like decision tree that ended up, we go for Moderna, and paid off very well for us.
And the last question of today is a very general one. The setback of the biotech sector seems to continue. What's your view and outlook for 2022?
Yeah, so I said 2021 was, if you can say, an underwhelming year compared to other healthcare parts. And most interestingly, for example, large pharma obviously had one of the best years, I would say, ever, almost. Although they address a similar patient population, they work in the same fields, but you can say they're diversified, obviously cash flow generative, dividend-paying companies. So there are multi-reasons why investors pick them over probably the more risky, or clearly more risky, smaller mid-cap. But we think the technology in almost all the cases is developed at the small mid-cap space. And as I just mentioned, Juno and Kite, I think it's not a coincidence that both companies were bought out, because Big Pharma watched it from the sideline and waited for the right result and the right trigger to say, okay, we pay a nice or a hefty premium, and then we obviously consolidate these technologies and companies. So I think it requires a multitude of things. It requires good clinical trial outcome. It requires a couple of products that will have sustainable and good launch curves, meaning they impact the healthcare system in the sense that a lot of patients get access to that. The company gets paid and obviously makes a profit out of this. And last but not least, it will be as well, obviously, consolidation, M&A, which in 2021 was extremely quiet, surprisingly quiet. And I think in recent weeks and months, I think we suffered much more from actually the fund flow perspective, rather than from a fundamental perspective. And that was for us the reason why we said we increase the leverage to some degree. We invest more into existing position, as what I have told you regarding the Q3. And we are, from a fundamental perspective, very optimistic how the biotech industry and even more so our portfolio is positioned.
Daniel, thanks again for this interesting presentation, and thank you, dear investors, for your attention and trust in BB Biotech. For your information, we will share the presentation slides with you after the live stream. With that, we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and hope to see you again in person in 2022. Thank you.